This is the 794T Unit 8 Extra Credit Test Review. Unit 8 is about the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. And we've got a series of questions that are going to help you with this test. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go right down the list and discuss each of these questions one by one. You can jot down the answers as you want to, fill out your own version of it, study it, and be ready for that test. And so here's the first question. We've got an image right here. And the question is, in what way does the painting illustrate advances that were being made during the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, and the Scientific Revolution? And so what you have here is you've got these two men. One is secular, one is clergy. And clergy means you work for the church. And one of these two shelves has scientific instruments and exploration stuff on it, and the other shelf has religious stuff on it, like a Lutheran songbook. And both shelves have globes, suggesting that both men were ambassadors to the whole world. But one is civic and secular, one is religious and clergy. So why did the Italian Renaissance begin in Italy, of all places? And we talked about this, and we had several reasons. One of those was that Italy was in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. It had direct access to trade all over that sea. And so that helped the Renaissance, in particular with trade and commerce. Italy was also highly urbanized. It wasn't all rural like the rest of Europe was. Italy also had, like I said, lots of three things: commerce, banking, and industry. And Italy had lots of wealthy merchants who had the means and the interest to support the Renaissance in terms of Renaissance art, culture, and learning. And so the next question is, explain the rise of the merchant class in cities like Florence. And keep in mind, like I said, you've got Florence being a center of industry, banking, and commerce. They also kicked the nobles out of the city in 1293. Keep that in mind. What institutions promoted wealth and trade in Italian city-states like Florence? Why are we even talking about Florence? Florence, of course, is a fairly large city in the north of Italy. It's still there today. And Florence is where this whole Renaissance thing started, somewhere between 1382 and 1402. And so we talked about that as well. So what is humanism? Humanism, and it's one of several isms that we learned with regard to the Renaissance. Humanism is the idea that humans are worth contemplating and worth studying and worth learning about. And therefore, intellectual and artistic thought should be devoted to human accomplishments, human expression, human emotion, human individuality. That's a big one. The human body, human achievements, human history, human fulfillment. And humanism was also an educational curriculum. Keep that in mind. And it was a curriculum that stressed these things. And it was designed for providing an education that would be broad, it would be practical, and it would be flexible. So secularism, what is it? When we say secularism, what do we mean? Remember that secularism is the idea that things outside the church, outside the realm of God and faith and salvation, were also worth contemplating. It goes hand in hand with humanism. Without one, you aren't likely to have the other. And this opened the door to such things as not only humanism, but also civics, civic government, and the study of the classics, the study of antiquity, times when there wasn't a Christian church. And secularism was a foundational advancement in philosophical thought that brought Renaissance thinkers out of the Middle Ages, or at least took another step towards bringing Europe out of the Middle Ages. Getting out of the Middle Ages took a long, long time. People disagree on when exactly that happened. It really kind of depends on what factors you look at. So what were the major characteristics of the Renaissance? Well, we've already started mentioning them. Humanism, huge characteristic of the Renaissance. Secularism, another big one. Also, we talked about this idea of eloquence and precision of expression. That permeates through Renaissance thinkers' words and Renaissance artists' work. And of course, the classics, ancient Greek and Roman art and literature that inspired and informed so many of these new accomplishments. This next question is kind of an obscure one. I'm not sure about the value of this question. Which statement expresses a belief shared by Renaissance humanist philosophers? I might say that they would adhere to a Greek saying, which was that man is at the center of all things. That's humanism. That's secularism. That's the classics. All of those wrapped up into one. So, what were the artistic developments that came from humanist values that impacted Renaissance art? And we looked at several. When we looked at Renaissance art, for example, we took note of linear perspective, backgrounds, emphasis on the human body, portraiture, and by the way, all these things are connected to each other. Images with human expression and human emotion. Rediscovering classical artistic achievements such as statues and domes, and secular subjects in art such as mythological subjects and everyday life and everyday people, not just religious subjects. And so that takes us to the Protestant Reformation. This is going by pretty fast. We're already to the Protestant Reformation. And the first question is, what was the most immediate cause of the Protestant Reformation? When and where did this cause happen? And we talked about the bigger long-term factors that caused the Protestant Reformation, and that includes the Renaissance and especially Christian humanism in Northern Europe. But the most immediate cause would probably have to be what happened on October 31st, 1517, and that was when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church, and he objected primarily in these 95 Theses to the sale of indulgences. And by the way, a thesis is a claim or an argument, so you can kind of think of it as his 95 arguments or his 95 claims. So like I said, the primary cause, the sale of indulgences, which he felt were highly unsound doctrinally. And they were also connected to corrupt practices such as simony. We talked about what simony was and what nepotism was and what pluralism was and what absenteeism was. And all of these, including the sale of indulgences, were forms of corruption that Martin Luther was just tired of. And that's what made him just, I'm going to put every single thing I have against the Catholic Church and against the sale of these indulgences, that I'm going to nail them all to the door of the Wittenberg Church, and we're all going to discuss this. So, what change in church practices was suggested by Martin Luther? Well, the primary one at this time, as far as immediate causes goes, is for the church to stop raising money from regular people by selling them these indulgences, which, like I said, were doctrinally unsound. One of the problems he had with the sale of indulgences, one of many, was the fact that the church really didn't have the authority to say what sins God was going to punish and what sins God wasn't going to punish. And he didn't like that at all. And so what did Martin Luther preach was the one thing that could get a person into heaven, and it certainly wasn't anything to do with purchasing indulgences. And that one thing can be down to one word, and that word is faith. Faith in Jesus. What does that not mean? It means not good works, not good deeds, not earning your way in, and certainly not buying your way in. And so the next question is, how did Martin Luther take advantage of the printing press? Well, keep in mind that he printed these 95 Theses, this is after he nailed them to the door of the Wittenberg Church, and other treatises in order to get the word out about his objections to the church. And even bigger, perhaps, he also translated the New Testament into German, the vernacular of the people he was living around. He himself was a German and had that Bible printed. So the Gutenberg printing press played a big role in Martin Luther's efforts. So that brings us to this next question. How did the Gutenberg printing press contribute to the Protestant Reformation? And it spread the Reformation throughout Europe, and it allowed for the printing of the Bible and other books in people's own vernacular languages so they could read these, not just in Latin, because your average person doesn't know Latin. Your average person knows French or German or English or Spanish. And now you can print religious texts in those languages. And keep in mind, the word for that is the vernacular, the language that you speak with your family, with your friends, with the people that you do business with, and all that. And so the question is, how did the Reformation change the political composition of Europe? What happened to Europe politically as a result of the Protestant Reformation? Well, in that Holy Roman Empire, noble princes chose between being Protestant and remaining Catholic. And much of Europe became politically divided between Protestant rulers and Catholic rulers. And the competition between the two led to numerous long and deadly wars over religion. We didn't go into a lot of detail about that, but France experienced a religious war that lasted about 30 years and killed 3 million people. And Europe went through a 30 years war that lasted 30 years and killed another 8 million people. So these religious wars were extremely deadly. So that's the answer to that question. What religious doctrine did John Calvin preach with regard to who was saved and who was not? Let me add the word did right there. So John Calvin, he preached a religious doctrine that we call predestination. And predestination taught that since God knows everything, right, he's God. God has to know everything. That God must also know, by default, past, present, and future. He's got to know not only everything in the past that happened and everything in the present, but since he's God, he must know everything in the future as well. And so therefore, God must already know from the moment we're created whether you're going to heaven or you're going to hell. So you are essentially created from scratch for one or the other of those two destinations, heaven or hell. You may have been created by God for the purpose of suffering in hell forever. That's John Calvin. And ironically, his religion spread like wildfire. It was extremely popular because it was so straightforward and so cut and dry and so black and white, and people like simplicity. So how did the Catholic Church respond to these religious changes that were brought about by the Protestant Reformation? Well, that happened in stages. At first, the Catholic Church was seriously injured as an institution by the Protestant Reformation, wasn't it? They lost millions of followers to Protestantism. Church leaders were caught off guard by all of this, and they didn't know what to do. Pope Paul III, however, he became Pope, and he took charge, and he led the Catholic Church to a rebound. And one of the most important things that he did was call together what was called the Council of Trent. And this was a council of church leaders that met on and off for 18 years, from 1545 to 1563. And their two goals were to create more church discipline and to clearly define the Catholic Church's beliefs. In other words, what did the Catholic Church stand for? What was the Catholic Church's message to the world? And were the Protestants right in their criticism of some or perhaps even all of the Catholic Church's beliefs and practices? And in the end, the Council of Trent came up with two main pieces of legislation, two main statements. Number one, the Catholic Church did need to clean up its act. They admitted that. Priests needed better training. Church corruption like simony and nepotism and even indulgences, those things needed to be eliminated. So that was statement number one. But statement number two was also quite powerful. And statement number two was that not a single one of the many Catholic beliefs that the Protestant reformers had criticized was going to change at all. Instead, the Catholic Church was going to stand by all of its traditional beliefs and was going to be prepared to defend those beliefs in vigorous debate with Protestants anywhere and everywhere. So that was the big response that the Catholic Church had to this Protestant Reformation. So, what was the major goal of the Counter-Reformation, also known as the Catholic Reformation? And the major goal was the Catholic Church wanted to reassert its power, its authority, its influence, and it wanted to win back believers. And it wanted to take its message to the world. Remember, the New World had been discovered, and Europeans were venturing out into Asia and Africa, and they wanted to get their message to the rest of the world before the Protestants got there. So that is the Renaissance. That's the Protestant Reformation. And now we have our third movement, our third new set of ideas from this chapter, from this unit, called the Scientific Revolution. So what two fundamental things was the Scientific Revolution based upon? Those two things were experimentation and observation. We're going to leave behind the beliefs and the prejudices and the biases that we had. We're going to leave behind the things that we've always been taught to believe. We're going to leave behind the ancient scientists like Aristotle and Galen, and we're going to start fresh. And we're going to do experiments, and we're going to make observations, and that is how we're going to push our new scientific knowledge forward. In what area of science did the scientific revolution begin? How about the composition of the universe? What could be more fundamental than that? Using new instruments like the telescope to find out what's going on up there. And so the first theory that Copernicus gave us, and he didn't come up with it himself, he admitted that, but he wrote a book about it that was very influential, and that was the Heliocentric Theory. So what did this theory say? The heliocentric theory said that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but rather just one of several bodies that orbit around the sun. That the sun is actually the center, and that's where you get the word heliocentric, sun-centered. But what problem did Copernicus run into with his theory? Copernicus's observations didn't quite match his theory mathematically. He could not completely explain why the planets orbited the sun in the way that they did. He was still feeling like the planets go around the sun in a perfect circle. They do not. That leads us to Johannes Kepler. What laws did Johannes Kepler come up with that resolved this problem? And Kepler came up with what were called the 3 laws of planetary motion, which proved Copernicus's basic ideas to be true and demonstrated mathematically how planets revolve around the sun. And if you've ever played with a yo-yo or you've ever played with tetherball, then you'll find that the 3 laws of planetary motion are actually very easy to understand. On a side note, the church wasn't too worried about Copernicus or Kepler and these new ideas about the Earth not being the center of the universe, as they had always believed, that the Earth was moving instead of other objects moving around it, as they had always believed and taught. They weren't worried about it because people like Kepler and Copernicus, they couldn't come up with the mechanics to explain why objects move in the first place. They didn't get worried until Galileo came along. They started to worry when he demonstrated with the laws of motion, including the law of inertia, that when there's no friction to hold an object in place, then that object's natural inclination is to move, and that's why planets moved. So what observations did Galileo make which disputed the geocentric theory. And keep in mind that the geocentric theory is the idea that the Earth is at the center and other planets move around the Earth. And it teaches that the Earth is the center of a very small universe, and that all of the substance above the Earth was made out of a perfect, uniform, and unchanging substance called quintessence, and that celestial bodies rotated around the Earth encased in a successive series of solid, interlocking, independently rotating, transparent spheres. And Aristotle had taught that. But Galileo's observations with a telescope of his own making showed something different. And keep in mind, Galileo was an expert instrument maker. He actually owned a shop with employees and everything that made and sold telescopes to other people. And he looked at objects like, for example, the moon, and found that the moon was actually not perfect and not uniform and not unchanging. And objects like Jupiter didn't fit Aristotle's view in the universe. He found 4 moons that were going around Jupiter, and sometimes they'd be in front of Jupiter, and sometimes they'd be behind Jupiter. That shouldn't happen if Jupiter is encased in a solid, transparent sphere. How did the printing press contribute to the scientific revolution? We've seen how the printing press contributed to the Renaissance. We've seen how the printing press contributed to the Protestant Reformation. And now we're seeing how it contributes to the scientific revolution. Keep in mind that the printing press allowed people, scientists, and learned folks all over Europe to read the same books, because all those books were coming off the same printing press. They were looking at the same writing, the same definitions, the same terminology, the same language, and they were sharing ideas much more efficiently and much more inexpensively, and that facilitated the spread of scientific knowledge all over. So what did Sir Isaac Newton publish, and what did his work do for readers of science? He published a book called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, and you could also call it Principia for short. He wrote it in Latin. In this work, Newton took the work of all the previous scientists that came before him that we've mentioned, like Copernicus and Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler and Galileo, and he explained them all in one unified mathematical system. He came up with the law of universal gravitation, which stated that gravity works the exact same way everywhere, every time, no matter where you are, whether you're up in space and you're talking about planets, or whether you're down on Earth and you're talking about an apple falling down from a tree. It works the same way everywhere. And he actually calculated how gravity works. In other words, he gave us a mathematical formula that showed that gravity goes up with the mass of an object and down with the distance between objects. So what set of laws did Newton publish? He published the law of universal gravitation. And Newton, interestingly enough, was never able to explain where gravitational force, where that energy actually comes from. He could tell you exactly how it worked, and he had theories about where that force actually comes from, but he couldn't tell you where it came from, and we still can't today. So that is our review. Those are all those questions answered. You can write those down in your review for extra credit. You can study this review, and it will really help you on the test. And I'm looking forward to seeing how you do. Good luck.